Hi, welcome back. In this video, we will learn about null safety in Flutter with the help of a real-world example. So let's start. As usual, I'll be starting with an empty template with just a main.dart file, and it's having an empty container with a white background set as home. So you can see that on the right side. So let's go to the pubspec YAML file. There you can see we have not added in dependencies yet. So let's go to the pub.dev, copy the HTTP package and paste it under the dependencies in pubspec and call flutter packages get and install the packages. Now let's create a screen. I'm gonna create a file homescreen.dart and create a class inside it, which I'm gonna call homescreen, and import the material package. So you can see that there is an error in the key parameter. That's because our project is not yet set up for null safety. So let's go to the pubspec.yaml file and make our project compatible for null safety. Let me go to the pubspec YAML file and change the environment from 2.6 to 2.12, which makes our project compatible with null safety. Now I'm gonna create the contents for the home screen. So a scaffold with an app bar and a container. And let's create another file called user services. Now let me show the service that we're gonna parse. So this is the one. I'll be providing the link to it in the description. It has 10 records now, and each record is having sub objects like address, and address is having the latitude and longitude, which is geo inside, and the company object as well. So let's parse this. Let me copy the whole response and go to app.queuetype.io. So I have made another video on how to create models easily with app.queuetype.io. I'll be providing the link to it in the description. So here, just paste it, give it a model name, and I'm gonna make all properties final. Okay, so make all properties final and copy the model classes that is generated. So you can see all the sub objects and every classes has been generated. Let's dig into it more deeply. So let's create another file. I'm gonna name it user underscore list underscore model dot dart. So paste it there. So you can see there are so many errors. So we're gonna fix it. That's because of the null safety. Let me rename the main class to user. So each record is a user record. Okay, so you can see the address object. Address has all the fields in it, and address has the geo object inside it, which has the latitude and longitude. So if you go to the response, you can see that that's the geo object, and you can see the company object as well. It has the name and other fields. Now let's go ahead and fix these errors. So if you look at the ID field, it says that the parameter ID can't have a value of null because of its type. So it's an integer type and it doesn't have a value now. So that means it is null and we cannot have a value of null, right? So the first way to fix it is just by adding a required keyword in front of the ID. So that means whoever using this object needs to supply the ID with a proper value other than null, because the ID, which is an integer, is not nullable now. Then how do we make a parameter nullable? So just by adding a question mark at the end of the type, you can make it nullable. So here I have made name, username, and all other fields nullable by just adding a question mark at the end of the type. So let's go ahead and do the same thing for the address, where we have street, city, zip code, and we will also make the geo object, which is another object, and made it nullable. That means it can accept a null value. So let's go ahead and, so you can see one error here. We'll fix it in a short while. Let's make the latitude and longitude nullable. And similarly for the company class, let's make all the member variables also nullable. But we have some more errors here, right? In the toJSON method call on some of the variables, it's saying there is some error. That's because we made the, so for example here, we made the address object nullable, and it says that you cannot invoke a method on a nullable object because it might be null and it can crash the application. So how do we fix this? So just add a question mark at the end of the variable, and it tells the compiler that don't execute the toJSON method if the variable is null. So this is just a safer way to prevent the null exceptions. So it will just return from there without executing the toJSON method, and so that will be just returning the null and it won't crash your application. But there is another way to fix this error. You can just put an exclamation mark instead of a question mark, but you should be very careful when you use the exclamation mark, because you should be very, like, you should be sure that this variable will never be null, because it's going to execute the toJSON method even if it is null. The compiler will just unwrap the variable even if it is null, and it will just execute the toJSON method and it can crash your application. So it's recommended that it shouldn't be used in a production code. So make sure the variable that you are just going to use with an exclamation mark can never be null if you want to use it. So that's about the two operators. So if you remember, we made the ID required, so that means it can now be null, and so the compiler is showing a warning here, it will never be null. So this condition, the ID is equal to null, that doesn't make any sense. So we can just remove it. So we had cleared all the errors from this model, and let's see how we can use this. So let's go to the user services.dart file, but before that let me create one more file, API status.dart, and declare two classes, success and failure, and we're going to use these classes inside the services class. The success class will have a code and a response which is of type object. As you can see, we need to initialize it, or we need to make it required, or give it some value, right? So I'm going to make it required in the constructor of the success class. Response also required. Now the error is gone. Let's make the similar changes in the failure class. So here I'm just renaming the response to error response and change the constructor to failure and error response as well. Okay, cool. So now these classes are ready to be used anywhere in your app. So let's change the user services class, create a new class user services. Here we will have a method to get the data from the service, but before that let me declare some constants. Let's create a new file, constants.dart, and let me paste in some constants here. So these are the constants that we are going to use when we call the services. We have the URL and some other constants for invalid response, no internet, unknown error, and success. Now let's write a method to get the data from the service. I'm going to call it get users, and inside the try catch method I'm going to say var response is equal to await. Let's import the HTTP package await get, that will be users list. Okay, we have some error here, so we need to pass in the URI. So URI.parse with users list. Let's catch some exceptions here. The first one would be HTTP exception, second one is socket exception, third one format exception, and fourth one, let's leave it as just a catch for all the other errors. So I have made another video on how to catch exceptions properly and show errors and everything. So I'll be providing the link to it in the description. Now let's get the response. And if the status code is 200, which is success, we are going to call users list from JSON and return this success object with success code. Otherwise, we are going to return the failure and the constant invalid response. And for error response, we can just pass in a string for now. And similarly for all the other exceptions. And let's change each message to no internet for HTTP exception and for socket exception, and for other exceptions let's say invalid format, and the last one is unknown error. Okay, let's change the constants as well. So that would be invalid format, no internet, invalid user invalid response. So now that our services class is ready, let's use it in our home screen. We are going to need a couple of variables here. First, let me override the init state method. So init state, remove the comment, and the variables that we are going to need now is list of users, because we're gonna display the list of users from the service, right? So list of user list. Let's import the user, and as you can see there is some error because we haven't initialized our user list, right? We need to give it some value initially, or we can make it nullable. So we can just add a question mark at the end of the type to make it nullable. Right now it's null, but or another way is make it late. You need to initialize it later, but make sure that you initialize it before you access it, otherwise it's going to be resulting in error. So here, this is how you can initialize it later or in the init state or in any other way before you access it. For now, I'm just gonna initialize it to an empty list in the declaration itself. We will also need another method to call the method in the service to get the data in the UI. So get users var result is equal to await user services dot get users. So that will get us the list of users from service, and we're going to check if the result is success. We need to get the response from the success object and cast it to list of user and call set state. So that will refresh the UI. Otherwise, if the result is a failure, let's leave it empty for now. We will handle it later and call get services in the init state. Now let's display the list of users in the UI. For that, let's add the list view dot separated widget, and in the item builder, let's return an empty container for now and a divider for separator builder. Item count would be users list dot length. Now let's write a separate widget for the list row. It's going to accept a user and a function on tap as parameters. So the constructor is showing error because we haven't added the user and on tap to the constructor. So let's add it, this dot user. Still it's going to show error because we haven't initialized it yet. So either we can make it nullable or we can make it required. So I'm going to make it required because we need the user object for the list row. Now for the on tap function, I'm going to make it nullable because we may not need it all the time, and I want to show something like if we are passing null and how we can prevent if the function is passed as null and everything. So please be patient and we'll see it in a short while. So let's create the UI. So in the UI for the list row, we will have a text and another text for email, the first one for name and second one for email. So here it's saying the text will not accept a null because here the name can be null, right? We had made it nullable, and the text view is saying if it is null, the text view is not going to accept it. So let's unwrap it. So for now we have just unwrapped it, but beware that this value can be null and it can result in errors if the user.name is actually null. So let's use the user list row widget and pass in the name. So that would be user list of index as user, and we are not passing in the onTap function here. Now let's set the home screen as home inside our my app widget, which is our root. So we are getting some errors. That's because of the list view inside the column, and the reason is both are unbounded height and we need to give it a height, or you can add shrink wrap. So shrink wrap is not recommended. It can cause performance issues, or you can wrap it inside an expanded widget. So for now I'm just setting as shrink wrap to true. So we have the data in the UI. So let's go ahead and make the user dot name is equal to null and see what happens. So it's saying there cannot be a setter because it's final. So for now I'm just removing the final from name. So we made it null, so you can see the text view cannot accept a null value, so the UI is throwing the error. So null check operator on a null value. So we are trying to unwrap a null value here, which is null. So it's going to result in the error. So using the unwrapping like this is not a recommended way to do it. So what are the other options we have? So let me remove this from here and undo it. Let's do the checking from the class where we parse the data. So that's the user list model. I'm gonna refactor the from JSON method to return the user object like this, and I'm gonna make the JSON name to null from here itself, so where we are parsing the data. So here let's set the value to null directly and refresh the UI. It's going to result in the error. So what if the value from the service is actually null? So we are already checking the null here. So if it is null, we are setting it to null actually, right? So we don't want that. So if it is null, let's set it to an empty value. And let's assume that the value from the service is actually null. So I'm trying to set it to null. So when the service returns, we'll set the name to null, and you can see that UI is not crashing. It's setting it to an empty value. Let's try to set it the text empty. So you can see if the value is null, it's going to return empty. Let's remove that, and this is another shortcut for the null check. So that's going to do the same thing that we did earlier. So let's try to change it to empty. So it's the same thing. So that's a cool handy way to do it, to do the null check. Okay, yeah, so that's one way to prevent all these null exceptions. So one more time without the null check, let's remove the null check from here, and if I refresh the UI, it's going to result in the error, right? And the null check operator on a null value. So if we go to the debug console, you can see the same error, null check operator on a null value. So let's go to the user list row. There we are trying to unwrap a null value. So let me show you one more thing. So what if the service is not even returning a JSON name key? So what would be the value then? So we already made it nullable, so it will be returning null, but we want to give it a default value if the key itself is not even returned from the service. So you can see this is how you can do it in the declaration in the constructor itself. So if you change it to empty, you can see it's taking the default empty value because we are not even parsing the name key in the from JSON. Let me uncomment it. Now we had made it null, and if I refresh the UI, so as we know, it should crash because we are trying to set a null value, right? Let's remove it and refresh the UI. So it's displaying the UI properly now. Let me just give it some spacing and arrange it properly. Okay, so let's look at the name once more. Now this time let's remove the nullable operator, and you can see there is a warning. So Flutter says that we don't need this operator anymore because it's not nullable right now, so it should have a proper value. So that's what it's assuming. So we're going to check. We need to put back the null check here. So what if the service is returning null? We need to give it some value, right? So let's leave it empty, or let's remove it and see what happens. Let's try to set the value to null and see what happens. So Flutter assumes that there will be some value, but we are trying to set it to null. So we are thinking that the service actually returned null. So still the UI is going to crash because our text view cannot accept a null value. So it's going to crash in the user list row itself because the user.name is null. So we need to have the null check here. Let's set it to empty if it is null. Refresh the UI and see what happens. So the UI is not crashing now. Let's try to set it to the value empty and see if it is being displayed in the UI, and also wrap the text widget inside a visibility widget and make it visible only if the user.name is not empty. Okay, now let's refresh the UI and see. Let me remove this, and if we refresh the UI, fetch the users, and it's going to display the proper name, and let's make it null. And so now it's not taking up the space because we had added the visibility widget, and it will make it invisible when it is empty and not take up this space. So here we have a warning. We don't need a null check here in the to.json, so we can just remove it. So the code is much cleaner now. You can apply it for other properties as well. So that's all for this video. In the next video, we will see how we can apply the null safety features to more complex objects, like for example here the company object. So that's another nested object inside our user object, right? So we'll see how we can apply this null safety and how we can prevent those null exceptions and errors in our project and make it much more stable. So if you like this video and if you found the video useful, please don't forget to like, subscribe and share. I'll be uploading the next video as soon as possible. The link to the source code for this demo is provided in the description, so please check it out. So thanks for watching and see you in the next video. Until then, bye.